Third graders. Voyage of the Dawn Treader, chapter XV. Would be chapter, did you say 15? I thought you did. Okay, this is The Wonders of the Last Sea. Very soon after they had left Ramandu's country, they began to feel that they had already sailed beyond the world. All was different. For one thing, they all found that they were needing less sleep. One did not want to go to bed, or eat much, or even talk except in low voices. Another thing was the light. There was too much of it. The sun, when it came up in the morning, looked twice, if not 3 times its usual size. And every morning, which gave Lucy the strangest feeling of all, the huge white birds, singing their song with human voices in a language no one knew, streamed overhead and vanished astern on their way to breakfast at Aslan's table. A little later, they came flying back and vanished into the east. "How beautifully clear the water is," said Lucy to herself. She leaned over the port side early in the afternoon on the second day. And it was. The first thing that she noticed was a little black object about the size of a shoe, traveling along at the same speed of the ship. For a moment, she thought it was something floating on the surface. But then it came floating a bit past a bit of stale bread, which the cook had just thrown out of the galley. And that bit of bread looked as if it were going to collide with the black thing, but it didn't. It passed over it. And Lucy now saw that the black thing could not be on the surface. Then the black thing suddenly got very much bigger and flicked back to normal size a moment later. Now Lucy knew that she had seen something just like what happened somewhere else, if only she could remember where. She held her hand to her head and screwed up her face and put out her tongue in an effort to remember. At last she did. Of course, it's like when you saw from the train on a bright sunny day. You saw the black shadow of your own coach running along the fields at the same pace as the train. And then, when you went into a cutting, immediately the same shadow flicked up close to you and got big, racing along in the grass of the cutting bank. Then there came out of the cutting, and flick, once more the black shadow had gone back to its normal size and was running along the fields. "It's our own shadow. The shadow of the Dawn Treader," said Lucy. "Our shadow running along the bottom of the sea." That time, when it got bigger, it went over a hill. But in that case, the water must be clearer than I thought. Good gracious, I must be seeing the bottom of the sea, fathoms and fathoms down. As soon as she said this, she realized that the great silvery expanse, which she had been seeing without noticing for some time, was really the sand on the seabed. And there were all sorts of darker and brighter patches, though not lights and shadows on the surface, but real things down on the bottom. At present, for instance, they were passing over a mass of soft purpley green, with a broad winding strip of pale gray in the middle of it. And now that she knew it was the bottom and how much she saw it much better, she could see the dark bits of stuff were much higher than the other bits and were waving gently, just like trees in the wind, said Lucy. And I do believe that's what they are. It's a submarine forest. Excuse me. Love a good cup of tea. They passed on above it, and presently the pale streak was joined by another pale streak. If I were down there, thought Lucy, that streak would be just like a road through the woods, and that place where it joins would be like a crossroads. Oh, I do wish it was. Hello, the forest is coming to an end. I do believe the streak really was a road. I can see it going on and on across the open sand. It's a different color, and it's marked out with something on the edges, dotted lines. Perhaps they're stones. And now it's getting wider. And it was not really getting wider, but it was getting nearer. She realized this because of the way which the shadow of the ship came rushing up towards her. And the road, she felt sure it was a road now, began to go in zigzags. Obviously, it was climbing up a steep hill. And when she held her head sideways to look at it, what she saw was very like what you see when you look down a winding road from the top of a hill. She could see the shafts of sunlight falling through the deep water onto the wooded valley. In the extreme distance, everything melting away into dim greenness. And some places, the sunny ones, she thought, were ultramarine blue. She could not, however, spend much time looking back. And what was coming into view in the forward direction was too exciting. The road had apparently now reached the top of the hill and ran straight forward. Little specks were moving to and fro on it. Now something more wonderful, fortunately in full sunlight, or as full as it can be when it falls through fathoms of water, flashed into sight. It was knobbly and jagged and pearly, or perhaps ivory-colored. She was so nearly straight above it that at first she could hardly make out what it was. But everything became plain when she noticed its shadow. The sunlight was falling across Lucy's shoulders, so the shadow of the thing lay stretched out on the sand behind it. By its shapes, she saw clearly that it was the shadow of towers and pinnacles and minarets and domes. "Why, it's a city or a huge castle," said Lucy to herself. "But I wonder why they've built it on top of a high mountain." Long afterwards, when she was back in England and talked over these adventures with Edmund, they thought of the reason, and I'm pretty sure it's a true one. In the sea, the deeper you go, the darker and colder it gets. And it's down there in the dark and cold that dangerous things live, the squid or the sea serpent or the kraken. The valleys are the wild, unfriendly places. The sea people feel about their valleys as we do about the mountains, and feel about their mountains as we do about valleys. It's in the heights, or in what we would call the shallows, that there's warmth and peace. The reckless hunters and brave knights of the sea go down into the depths on quests and adventures, but return home to the heights for rest and peace, courtesy and counsel, sports, the dances, and the songs. They had passed the sea, and the seabed was now still rising. It was only a few hundred feet below the ship now. The road had disappeared. They were sailing above an open park-like country, dotted with little groves of highly colored vegetation. And then Lucy squealed aloud with excitement. She had seen people. There were between 15 and 20 of them, and all mounted on seahorses. Not the tiny little seahorses which you may have seen in museums, but horses rather bigger than themselves. They must be noble and lordly people, Lucy thought, for she could catch a gleam of a gold on some of their foreheads, and streams of emerald or orange-colored stuff fluttering from their shoulders in the current. Then, "Oh, bother these fish," said Lucy, for a whole shoal of small, fat fish swam quite close to the surface, and had come between her and the sea people. But though this spoiled her view, it led to the most interesting thing of all. Suddenly, a fierce little fish, of a kind she had never seen before, came darting up from below, snapped, grabbed, and sank rapidly with one of the fat fish in its mouth. And all the sea people were sitting on their horses, staring up at what had happened. They seemed to be talking and laughing. Before the hunting fish had gotten back to them with its prey, another of the same kind came up from the sea people, and Lucy was almost certain that one big seaman who was on the seahorse in the middle of the party had sent it or released it, as if he had been holding it back until then, with in his hand or on his wrist. "Why, I do declare," said Lucy, "it's a hunting party, or more like a hawking party. Yes, that's it. They ride out with these little fierce fish on their wrists, just as we used to ride out with falcons in our wrists when we were kings and queens at Cair Paravel long ago. And then they fly them, or I suppose I should say they swim them, at the others. How—" She stopped suddenly, because the scene was changing. The sea people had noticed the Dawn Treader. The shoal of fish had scattered in every direction. People themselves were coming back to find out the meaning of the big black thing which had come between them and the sun. Now they were so close to the surface that if they had been in air instead of water, Lucy could have spoken to them. There were men and women both. All wore coronets of some kind and many chains of pearls. There were no other clothes, and their bodies were the color of old ivory and their hair dark purple. The king in the center, no one could mistake him for anything but a king, looked proudly and fiercely into Lucy's face and shook a spear in his hand. The knights did the same thing. The faces of the ladies were filled with astonishment. Lucy felt sure that they had never seen a ship or a human before. And how should they in seas beyond the world's end, where no ship ever came? "What you staring at, Lou?" said a voice close beside her. Lucy had been so absorbed in what she was seeing that she started at the sound, and when she turned around, she found that her arm had gone dead from leaning on so long on the rail in one position. Drineen and Edmund were beside her. "Look," she said. They both looked, but almost at once Drineen said in a low voice, "Turn around at once, Your Majesty. That's right, with our backs to the sea. Don't look as if we're talking about anything important. What's the matter? Said Lucy as she obeyed. It'll never do for the sailors to see all that, said Drinian. We'll have men falling in love with the sea women, or falling in love with the undersea country itself and jumping overboard. I've heard of that kind of thing happening in strange seas. It's always unlucky to see these people. But we used to know them, said Lucy, in the old days at Cair Paravel when my brother Peter was High King. They came to the surface and sang at our coronation. I think that must have been a different kind, Lou, said Edmund. They could live in the air as well as underwater. I rather think these can't. By the look of them, they'd have surfaced and started an attack on us long ago if they could. They seem very fierce. At any rate, began Drinian, but at that moment 2 sounds were heard. One was a plop, the other was a voice from the fighting top shouting, "Man overboard!" Then everyone was busy. Some of the sailors hurried aloft to take in the sail, others hurried below to get the oars, and Rince, who was on duty on the poop deck, began to put the helm hard over so that they came around and back to the man who had gone overboard. By now, everyone knew that it wasn't strictly a man. It was Reepicheep. Drat that mouse, said Drinian. It's more trouble than all the rest of the ship's company put together. If there's a scrape to be gotten into, it will get it. It ought to be put in irons, keel-hauled, marooned, have its whiskers cut off. Can anyone see the little blighter? All this didn't mean that Drinian disliked Reepicheep. On the contrary, he liked him very much, and was therefore frightened about him, and being frightened put him in a bad temper. Just as your mother is much angrier with you for running out into the road in front of a car than a stranger would be. No one, of course, was afraid of Reepicheep drowning, for he was an excellent swimmer. But the 3 who knew what was going on below the water were afraid of those long, cruel spears in the hands of the sea people. In a few minutes, the Dawn Treader had come round, and everyone could see the black blob in the water, which was Reepicheep. He was chattering with greatest excitement, but as his mouth kept on getting filled with water, nobody could understand what he was saying. He'll blurt the whole thing out if we don't shut him up, said Drinian. To prevent this, he rushed to the side and lowered a rope himself, shouting to the sailors, "All right, people, all right, back to your places. I hope I can heave a mouse up without any help." And as Reepicheep began climbing up the rope, not very nimbly, for his fur was wet and made him heavy, Drinian leaned over and whispered to him, "Don't tell, not a word." But when the dripping mouse had reached the deck, it turned out not to be at all interested in the sea people. "Sweet," he cheeped, "sweet, sweet." "What are you talking about?" asked Drinian crossly. "And you needn't shake yourself all over me either." "I tell you the water's sweet," said the mouse. "Sweet, fresh, it isn't salt." For a moment, no one quite took in the importance of this, but then Reepicheep once more repeated the old prophecy. "Where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, there is the utter east." Then everyone understood. "Let me have a bucket, Rheinelf," said Drinian. It was handed to him, and he lowered it, and up it came again. The water shone in it like glass. "Perhaps your Majesty would like to taste it first," Drinian said to Caspian. The king took the bucket in both hands, raised it to his lips, sipped, and drank deeply and raised his head. His face was changed. Not only his eyes, but everything about him seemed to be brighter. "Yes," he said, "it is sweet. That's real water, that. I'm not sure that it isn't going to kill me, but if it's a death that I would have chosen if I had known about it till now." "What do you mean?" said Edmund. It's like light more than anything else," said Caspian. "That's what it is," said Reepicheep. "Drinkable light. We must be very near the end of the world now." There was a moment's silence, and then Lucy knelt down on the deck and drank from the bucket. "The loveliest thing I've ever tasted," she said with a kind of gasp, "but, oh, it's strong. We shan't need anything to eat now." And one by one, everyone on board drank, and for a long time they were all silent. They felt almost too well and strong to bear it. And presently they began to notice another result. As I have said before, there had been too much light ever since they left the island of Ramandu. The sun too large, though not too hot, the sea too bright, and the air too shining. Now the light grew no less. If anything, it increased. But they could bear it. They could look straight at the sun without blinking. Never do that, by the way, third graders. They could see more light than they had ever seen before. The deck and the sail and their own faces and bodies became brighter and brighter, and every rope shone. And next morning when the sun rose, now 5 or 6 times its old size, they stared hard into it, and they could see every feather of the birds that came flying from it. Hardly a word was spoken on board all that day, till about dinner time. No one wanted any dinner. The water was enough for them. Drinian said, "I can't understand this. There's not a breath of wind. The sail hangs dead. The sea is as flat as a pond, and yet we drive on as fast as if there were a gale behind us." "I've been thinking that too," said Caspian. "We must be caught in some strong current." Said Edmund. "That's not so nice if the world really has an edge and we're getting nearer to it." "You mean," said Caspian, "that we might just, well, pour over it?" "Yes, yes," cried Reepicheep, clapping his paws together. "That's how I've always imagined it. The world was like a great round table, and the waters of the ocean just endlessly pouring over the edge. The ship will tip up, stand on her head for one moment, then we shall see over the edge, and then down, 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 the rush, the speed." "And what do you think will be waiting for us at the bottom, eh?" said Drinian. "Aslan's country, perhaps," said the mouse, its eyes shining. "Or perhaps there isn't any bottom. Perhaps it just goes down forever and ever. But whatever it is, won't it be worth anything just to have looked for one moment beyond the edge of the world?" "But look here," said Eustace, "this is all rot. The world's round. I mean round like a ball, not like a table." "Our world is," said Edmund. "But is this?" "What do you mean to say," said Caspian, "that you 3 come from a round world, round like a ball, and you never told me? It's really too bad for you, because we have fairy tales in which there are round worlds, and I've always loved them. I never believed there were any real ones, but I've always wished there were, and I've always longed to live in one. I'd give anything. I wonder if you could get into our world. I wonder why you can get into our world and we can never get into yours. If only I had had a chance. It must be exciting to live on a thing like a ball. Have you ever been to the parts of the world where people walk about upside down?" Edmund shook his head. "It isn't like that," he added. "There's nothing particularly exciting about a round world when you're there." Speaking of ends, tomorrow we'll read the very last chapter. Hope you've been enjoying this. Have a great day, and know that I love you and I miss you.